I never thought I would be sitting in a federal courthouse filing a discrimination lawsuit. But there I was on a Tuesday morning in March, watching my attorney slide paperwork across the desk to the clerk while my service dog, Apollo, sat calmly at my feet. My name is Derek Kellerman, and 6 months earlier I had moved into what I thought would be my dream home in Scottsdale, Arizona. The place was perfect, a beautiful 3-bedroom ranch with a pool, mountain views, and enough space for me to work from home as a software developer. I have a neurological condition that causes seizures, which is why Apollo, a trained medical alert dog, has been my constant companion for the past 4 years. He can detect when I am about to have a seizure, sometimes up to 20 minutes before it happens, giving me time to get somewhere safe and take my emergency medication. The problem started exactly 2 weeks after I moved in. I was checking my mailbox when a woman in her late 40s with blonde highlights and an orange spray tan approached me with a clipboard. She wore white capri pants and a coral blouse that looked like it cost more than my monthly car payment. "Excuse me, are you the new resident at 4782 Desert Vista Drive?" she asked, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "That's me, Derek Kellerman." I extended my hand, which she shook with the enthusiasm of someone touching a wet towel. "I am Patricia Hendricks, president of the Desert Vista Homeowners Association. I need to speak with you about a violation." Apollo shifted beside me, his tail doing a small wag. He was wearing his service dog vest, clearly marked with patches indicating his status. "A violation. I just moved in 2 weeks ago." Patricia's eyes drifted down to Apollo with obvious distaste. "Yes, well, that is precisely what we need to discuss. Our HOA bylaws state very clearly that residents are limited to 1 pet under 25 pounds. Your dog appears to exceed that limit." I felt my jaw tighten. Apollo is not a pet. He is a service animal. I have a seizure disorder, and he is trained to alert me before episodes occur. Be that as it may, the rules apply to all residents equally. We cannot make exceptions, or everyone will want one. She pulled a piece of paper from her clipboard and handed it to me. "This is your official notice. You have 30 days to remove the animal from the property or face fines of $200 per day." "This is illegal," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger rising in my chest. "The Fair Housing Act protects my right to have a service animal regardless of HOA pet restrictions." Patricia's smile turned icy. "I suggest you review our governing documents, Mr. Kellerman. This is a private community with standards we all agreed to uphold when we purchased our homes. I will expect your compliance within the stated time frame." She turned on her heel and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with Apollo and a piece of paper that made my blood boil. That evening, I did exactly what she suggested. I pulled out every document from my home purchase and spent 3 hours reading through the HOA bylaws, covenants, and restrictions. Nowhere in any of them was there any mention of service animals or reasonable accommodations for disabilities. The pet policy was straightforward: 1 pet under 25 pounds, certain breeds prohibited, and all pets required to be leashed in common areas. But federal law was crystal clear. Service animals were not pets, and HOA rules could not supersede the Fair Housing Act. I drafted a response letter that night, attaching documentation of Apollo's training certification, a letter from my neurologist explaining my condition and medical necessity for a service animal, and copies of the relevant sections of the Fair Housing Act. I sent it via certified mail the next morning, feeling confident that once Patricia understood the legal situation, this would be resolved. I was wrong. 10 days later, I received another letter from the HOA, this time signed by Patricia and two other board members, Margaret Wilson and Susan Chen. The letter acknowledged receipt of my documentation, but stated that, after careful review by their attorney, they were denying my request for accommodation. Their reasoning was that my condition did not constitute a disability under their interpretation of the law, and that I had failed to follow proper procedures for requesting accommodations, which apparently required appearing before the board at a monthly meeting to present my case in person. The letter also informed me that I was now in violation for an additional offense. Apollo had been seen off-leash in my backyard, which violated community standards. There was a grainy photo attached showing Apollo in my fenced yard, taken from what must have been my neighbor's second-story window. This was escalating fast, and I realized I needed legal help. I started researching disability rights attorneys in the Phoenix area and found a firm called Morrison and Associates that specialized in housing discrimination cases. I called them that afternoon and spoke with a paralegal named Jennifer who scheduled me for a consultation the following week. In the meantime, life in the neighborhood became increasingly uncomfortable. I noticed Patricia driving past my house multiple times a day, slowing down as if she was looking for violations. My next-door neighbor, an older man named Frank who had been friendly when I first moved in, stopped waving when he saw me. The woman across the street who had brought me cookies during my first week now avoided eye contact when we both happened to be getting our mail at the same time. I tried to go about my normal routine. I worked from home most days, took Apollo for walks through the neighborhood in the evening, and used my pool on the weekends. But I could feel eyes on me constantly. It felt like I was living under surveillance in my own home. My consultation with the attorney, David Morrison, confirmed what I already knew. The HOA was blatantly violating federal law. David was in his mid-50s with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to assess everything. He listened to my story while taking detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is pretty cut and dried," he said after I finished. "The Fair Housing Act is very clear on this issue. Service animals are not subject to HOA pet restrictions, period. The fact that they are requiring you to appear before the board and defend your disability is also problematic. They cannot demand that you prove the nature of your disability beyond basic documentation, which you already provided. So what do? First, we send them a strongly worded letter explaining exactly how they are violating federal law and giving them one opportunity to reverse their decision. We request a written apology and confirmation that you will face no further harassment regarding Apollo. We also request that any fines or violations they have issued be removed from your record. And if they refuse," David's expression was grim, "then we file a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and prepare for litigation. I will be honest with you, Derek. These cases can take time, and HOAs sometimes dig in their heels even when they know they are wrong. But the law is on your side, and I am confident we will prevail." We discussed his fee structure, which included a contingency arrangement since these cases often resulted in the defendant paying attorney's fees if we won. I signed a retainer agreement, and David's firm sent the letter to the HOA that same day. I allowed myself to hope that would be the end of it. Surely once they received a letter from an attorney clearly explaining the law, they would back down. Instead, things got worse. 3 days after David's letter was sent, I came home from a grocery run to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It was another violation notice, this time citing me for excessive noise disturbance, because Apollo had allegedly been barking continuously between 2 and 4 p.m. the previous Tuesday. The fine was $500. I stared at the notice in disbelief. I had been home that entire afternoon working in my office, and Apollo had been sleeping at my feet the whole time. He barely barked anyway, it was not part of his nature, and he had never been a nuisance barker. I called David immediately. "They are retaliating," I told him. "These violations are false. They are making things up now." "Document everything," David instructed. "Do you have any way to prove you were home and that Apollo was not barking?" I was on a video conference call from 1:30 to 3 that afternoon. My colleagues can confirm Apollo was quiet. He was literally visible in the background of my video feed, sleeping. Perfect. Get written statements from anyone who was on that call. Take screenshots if the meeting was recorded. We are building a retaliation case now, which actually strengthens our position. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 4 more violation notices. One claimed that my garbage cans were left out past the designated time, which was false. Another stated that I had parked a commercial vehicle in my driveway overnight, which was absurd since I drove a Honda Civic. A third cited me for having outdoor lights that were too bright, even though the lights were the same ones that had been installed when I bought the house. The fourth claimed that Apollo had threatened another resident during a walk, which was completely fabricated. Apollo was trained to ignore other people and animals while working, and the alleged incident supposedly occurred on a date when I had actually been out of town visiting my parents in Colorado. The fines were adding up to thousands of dollars. Each notice threatened legal action if payment was not received within 15 days, and warned that the HOA could place a lien on my property for unpaid fines. I was not sleeping well. The stress was affecting my health, and I had 2 seizures in a 3-week period, which was more than I had experienced in over a year. Apollo's alerts gave me warning both times, allowing me to take my medication and prevent the seizures from being severe, but it was a stark reminder of how much I needed him. David filed the HOA complaint in early May, about 2 months after the initial violation notice. The complaint outlined the HOA's refusal to provide reasonable accommodation for my disability, the pattern of retaliation through false violations, and the harassment I had experienced. HOA would investigate, but David warned me the process could take months. "We should also consider filing in federal court," he said during a meeting in his office. "We have a strong case for disability discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. The retaliation pattern is well documented, and the emotional distress and impact on your health strengthen our damages claim." How long would a lawsuit take? Could be anywhere from a year to 3 years, depending on whether they settle or take it to trial. But filing suit puts immediate pressure on them. Once they have to forward this to their insurance company and their insurance attorney reviews the case, there is a good chance they will want to settle quickly. "Let's do it," David smiled. "I was hoping you would say that. I will have the complaint drafted by end of week." That Friday evening, I was grilling chicken on my back patio when my doorbell rang. Apollo alerted before I even heard the sound, his ears perking up as he moved toward the front door. I followed him and looked through the peephole to see a man in his 30s wearing a polo shirt with the HOA management company logo on it. I opened the door. "Can I help you, Derek Kellerman?" he asked, holding an iPad. "Yes. I am Brad Stevens from Premier Community Management. The HOA board has asked me to conduct a property inspection based on multiple reported violations. You cannot just show up and demand to inspect my property without notice." Brad looked uncomfortable. "According to the governing documents, The HOA has the right to inspect properties with 24 hours written notice for exterior inspections or to verify compliance with community standards. Did you provide 24 hours written notice? I believe a notice was sent earlier this week. I received no such notice, and even if you had sent one, you do not have the right to enter my property for an inspection without my consent. Brad shifted his weight. Look, Mr. Kellerman, I am just trying to do my job. The board members have been calling my office constantly about your property. If you let me do a quick walk around the exterior, I can document that everything is fine and hopefully get them to back off. I studied him for a moment. He seemed genuine, not hostile like Patricia and the board members. The board members are harassing me because I have a disability and use a service dog. They are violating federal housing law, and I have an attorney representing me. I would be happy to discuss this with you another time if you contact my attorney first, but I am not consenting to any inspection right now. Brad nodded slowly. I understand. Can I have your attorney's contact information? I gave him David's business card, which I now kept handy by the door. Brad thanked me and left, and I watched him sit in his car for several minutes, apparently making phone calls. The federal lawsuit was filed on May 28th. The complaint named the Desert Vista Homeowners Association, Patricia Hendricks in her capacity as board president, and Premier Community Management Company as defendants. We were seeking injunctive relief requiring them to accommodate my service animal, compensatory damages for emotional distress, and the impact on my health, punitive damages for willful violation of federal law, and attorney's fees. The lawsuit made the local news. A reporter from the Arizona Republic called me for comment, and after discussing it with David, I agreed to a brief interview. The story ran online that evening with the headline, "Scottsdale Man Sues HOA Over Service Dog Discrimination." It included a photo of me and Apollo in my backyard and quoted me saying, "I just want to live peacefully in my home with the medical assistance I need. No one should have to fight for basic civil rights in 2025." The story was picked up by several local TV stations, and a crew from Channel 12 News came to interview me the next day. The reporter, a woman named Lisa Chen, was sympathetic and asked thoughtful questions about my disability and why Apollo was essential to my safety. The segment aired that evening during the 6 o'clock news, and my phone started buzzing with texts from friends and family who had seen it. But the media attention seemed to infuriate the HOA even more. 2 days after the news segment aired, I received a certified letter informing me that my home was being scheduled for a special assessment to cover legal fees the HOA was incurring due to my lawsuit. The assessment was for $8,000, payable within 30 days. I forwarded it to David, who called me back within an hour. "This is blatant retaliation," he said, and I could hear the anger in his voice. "They cannot assess you individually to cover legal fees for a lawsuit you filed against them. That is not how special assessments work. We are filing an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction. This has gone far enough." The emergency hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later in federal court in Phoenix. David prepared extensively, and I provided him with every document, every violation notice, every email, and every piece of evidence we had collected. He also prepared me to testify, explaining what questions I would be asked and how to answer clearly and concisely. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Apollo sensed my anxiety and stayed close, occasionally nudging my hand with his nose. I kept thinking about everything that had happened over the past 4 months. All I had wanted was to live in my house with my service dog. Instead, I had been subjected to harassment, false accusations, thousands of dollars in bogus fines, and now a lawsuit that was consuming my time, energy, and peace of mind. The federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix was an imposing building with tall columns and tight security. David met me outside at 8:30 a.m., and we went through security together, with Apollo calmly walking beside me in his vest. Several people in the courthouse stopped to admire him, and one court security officer mentioned that her brother also had a seizure-alert dog. We made our way to the courtroom on the 4th floor. The defendants were already there: Patricia Hendricks, Margaret Wilson, Susan Chen, and two men I recognized as other HOA board members, along with a woman who I assumed was their attorney. Patricia's eyes widened when she saw me, and she whispered something to the woman next to her. The hearing began at 9 a.m. sharp. Judge Monica Rivera took the bench, a woman in her early 60s with dark hair pulled back in a bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She had a reputation, David had told me, for being no-nonsense and particularly protective of civil rights. David presented our case first, walking through the timeline of events, the documentation of my disability and Apollo's training, the HOA's denial of accommodation, and the escalating pattern of retaliation. He introduced the violation notices, the special assessment letter, and declarations from my doctor, my video conference colleagues who witnessed the false barking complaint, and a dog trainer who evaluated Apollo and confirmed his excellent behavior and training. Then, it was my turn to testify. David asked me to explain my disability, and I described how my seizure disorder had developed after a car accident 5 years earlier, how the seizures could strike without warning, and how dangerous they could be if I did not have time to prepare. Can you describe how Apollo assists you? David asked. Apollo is trained to detect chemical changes in my body that occur before a seizure. He will alert me by pawing at my leg and making direct eye contact. That gives me usually 15 to 20 minutes to get somewhere safe, take my emergency medication, and prepare. Since I got Apollo 4 years ago, I have not had a single seizure that resulted in injury. Before Apollo, I had fallen twice during seizures, once hitting my head badly enough to require stitches. What has been the impact of the HOA's actions on your health? I took a breath. The stress has been overwhelming. I have had 3 seizures in the past 4 months, which is more than I had in the entire previous year. The constant harassment, the feeling of being watched and targeted in my own neighborhood, the financial pressure from the fines and this lawsuit, it has all taken a toll. I feel anxious all the time. I am not sleeping well, and I am terrified they are going to find a way to force me out of my home. The defendant's attorney, a severe-looking woman named Christine Fuller, cross-examined me. She tried to suggest that I had not followed proper procedures for requesting accommodations, that I had been uncooperative with the management company, and that some of the violations might have been legitimate. David objected to several of her questions, and Judge Rivera sustained most of the objections. When Christine tried to question whether my disability was severe enough to require a service animal, the judge interrupted her. Counselor, the plaintiff has provided extensive medical documentation from a board-certified neurologist. Unless you have expert testimony to contradict that documentation, I suggest you move on. Christine's face flushed, but she continued. Is it not true, Mr. Kellerman, that you deliberately sought media attention for this dispute? I spoke to reporters after this lawsuit was filed, yes. I did not seek them out, they contacted me after the complaint became public record. And is it not true that you have refused to work with the HOA board to find a compromise solution? What compromise would that be? I asked. Should I compromise on my right to use medical equipment that keeps me safe? Should I compromise on federal civil rights law? Judge Rivera looked like she was suppressing a smile. When Christine finished, Patricia Hendricks took the stand. David's cross-examination was methodical and devastating. He walked her through each violation notice, asking her to explain the evidence that supported each one. She became flustered, admitting she had not personally witnessed most of the alleged violations but had relied on reports from concerned residents. "You have any written documentation of these reports?" David asked. Some of them were phone calls. "Did you document those phone calls?" "Not specifically, no." "So you issued violation notices and levied fines totaling over $7,000 based on unverified, undocumented complaints. We have a duty to enforce community standards. You also have a duty to comply with federal fair housing law, do you not?" Patricia's jaw tightened. "We are not discriminating against anyone. Our rules apply to everyone equally, including people with disabilities who require service animals. The rules state one pet under 25 pounds. Mr. Kellerman's service dog is not a pet, is it? It is still an animal in the community. An animal that is protected under federal law, correct? That is your interpretation." David paused, letting her answer hang in the air. "Mrs. Hendricks, have you or anyone on the HOA board consulted with an attorney who specializes in fair housing law about this matter?" Patricia hesitated. "We consulted with our general counsel." "And what did your general counsel advise?" Christine Fuller stood. "Objection. Attorney-client privilege." Judge Rivera looked at Patricia. "Mrs. Hendricks, did your attorney advise you that you could legally deny Mr. Kellerman's request for a service animal?" Patricia shifted in her seat. "He said the issue was complicated." "Did he specifically tell you that you had the legal right to deny the accommodation and levy fines?" "He said we should consult with a fair housing specialist, but we decided to proceed based on our bylaws." Judge Rivera made a note, and I saw David suppress a smile as he sat down. The hearing lasted almost 4 hours. By the time closing arguments concluded, it was early afternoon. Judge Rivera announced she would rule from the bench. "I have reviewed the evidence and heard the testimony," she began, "and I find this to be one of the clearer violations of the Fair Housing Act I have encountered. The plaintiff has provided extensive documentation of his disability and the medical necessity of his service animal. The defendant HOA denied his request for accommodation despite that documentation, and then engaged in what can only be described as a campaign of harassment and retaliation." Patricia's face had gone pale. "The violation notices issued to the plaintiff are transparently pretextual," Judge Rivera continued. "Many of them are demonstrably false, and none were issued with proper documentation or investigation. The special assessment levied against the plaintiff individually to cover legal fees in this very lawsuit is particularly egregious and shows a stunning lack of understanding of both HOA governance and basic fairness." She looked directly at Patricia and the other board members. "The Fair Housing Act is not a suggestion. It is federal law, and it exists to protect people with disabilities from exactly this kind of discrimination. Service animals are not pets. They are medical equipment, as essential to Mr. Kellerman's safety as a wheelchair is to someone with a mobility impairment. Your refusal to recognize that, despite clear evidence and legal guidance, demonstrates willful disregard for the law." Judge Rivera granted our motion for a preliminary injunction. The HOA was immediately ordered to cease all enforcement actions against me related to Apollo, to rescind all violation notices and fines they had issued, to remove any negative marks from my property records, and to rescind the special assessment. They were also ordered to provide written notice to all residents that service animals were permitted in the community regardless of pet restrictions, and to refrain from any further retaliation against me. Violation of this order will result in contempt sanctions, Judge Rivera warned. And I am putting defendants on notice that based on what I have seen today, the plaintiff has a very strong case for not only injunctive relief but substantial damages. I strongly suggest you consult with qualified fair housing counsel and consider settlement. We left the courthouse in high spirits. David was grinning as we walked to the parking garage. That was about as good as it gets, he said. Judge Rivera basically told them they are going to lose at trial. Their insurance company is going to push hard for settlement now. He was right. 10 days later, Christine Fuller contacted David to schedule a settlement conference. The mediation was held in mid-July at a neutral location, a conference room in a downtown Phoenix office building. I attended along with David, facing Patricia, 2 other board members, Christine, and a representative from the HOA's insurance company, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Robert, who spent the first hour of the mediation reviewing the file with a deepening frown. The mediator was a retired judge named Howard Campbell, who explained the process, and then separated us into different rooms to discuss settlement positions. David and I spent the morning strategizing. We were seeking a written apology, confirmation of my right to Apollo without any restrictions, removal of all violation notices from my record, compensation for the emotional distress and health impacts, and full payment of attorney's fees and costs. The financial demand was significant. David suggested we start at $250,000 in damages plus attorney's fees. I was shocked at first, but he explained that the number reflected not just compensation for what I had been through, but also punitive damages to deter future discrimination. The mediation lasted all day. The mediator went back and forth between rooms, carrying offers and counteroffers. The HOA initially offered to drop all violations and provide a written statement confirming my right to Apollo, but no monetary damages. We rejected that immediately. By late afternoon, we had reached an agreement. The HOA would pay $175,000 in damages to me personally, plus $95,000 in attorney's fees and costs. They would provide a formal written apology acknowledging their violation of federal law. They would revise their HOA governing documents to include explicit language about service animals and reasonable accommodations for disabilities. And they would require all board members to complete fair housing training. Patricia Hendricks would resign as board president, though she could remain on the board if the other members agreed. Most importantly to me, the settlement included a provision that I would face no further action related to Apollo, that all violation notices would be expunged from my record, and that any future complaints about my property would be handled according to the same standards as any other resident, with proper documentation and investigation. We signed the settlement agreement that evening. David explained that it would take about 30 days for the insurance company to process the payment, but the other provisions would take effect immediately. I drove home feeling like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Apollo sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, tongue flapping in the warm evening air. When we pulled into my driveway, I noticed Frank next door was watering his lawn. He saw me and actually waved. "Hey, Derek," he called out. "Glad things worked out for you." I always thought the board was out of line with that whole thing. I wanted to ask why he had not said something earlier, why no one in the neighborhood had stood up for me when I was being harassed, but I just nodded. Thanks, Frank. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to normal. The HOA sent out the required notice to all residents about service animals, and according to the settlement terms, they hired a fair housing consultant to review all their policies and procedures. Patricia resigned as president, and Margaret Wilson took over temporarily. I ran into Margaret at the community pool one Saturday in August. She approached me cautiously, and I braced for another confrontation, but she surprised me. "Derek, I owe you an apology," she said quietly. I went along with Patricia because I trusted her judgment, and I did not really understand the legal issues. "But what we put you through was wrong. I am sorry." I studied her face and saw genuine remorse. "I appreciate you saying that." The fair housing consultant we have been working with has been eye-opening. I had no idea how many ways HOAs can inadvertently discriminate. "We are making a lot of changes." "That is good to hear." She hesitated, then added, "For what it is worth, Patricia is pretty much a pariah now. Most of the board members are furious at her for exposing the HOA to such a huge financial liability. Several homeowners are talking about trying to remove her from the board entirely. I did not take any pleasure in that, but I understood it. Actions had consequences. The settlement check arrived in mid-August. David's firm took their fees and costs off the top, and I received $175,000. It was more money than I had ever had at once, and while it did not erase what I had been through, it did provide some measure of justice and compensation. I used some of the money to install security cameras around my property, not because I expected more trouble, but because I wanted to feel safe in my own home. I donated $20,000 to a service dog training organization that had helped me get Apollo. And I invested the rest, deciding to keep it as an emergency fund and future down payment if I ever decided to move to a neighborhood without an HOA. But surprisingly, I found I did not want to move. The house was perfect for me, and once the harassment stopped, I actually enjoyed the neighborhood. I started getting to know some of my neighbors better, the ones who had been quietly supportive all along, and even made a few friends. There was a retired couple 3 doors down, Tom and Alina, who invited me over for dinner and loved Apollo. There was a young family across the street with 2 kids who always asked if they could pet Apollo when they saw us on walks. Life got better. My seizures decreased again as my stress levels normalized. Work was going well, and I got a promotion in September that came with a significant raise. Apollo and I settled into a comfortable routine of morning walks, work, afternoon pool time, and evening strolls through the neighborhood. In October, I received a call from a disability rights organization based in Washington, D.C. They had read about my case and wanted to know if I would be willing to speak at a conference about housing discrimination and the challenges people with disabilities face in dealing with HOAs. I agreed, and in November, I flew to D.C. to speak on a panel. It was intimidating at first, standing in front of 300 people, but I told my story and felt like maybe some good could come from what I had experienced. Several people approached me afterward to share their own stories, and I realized how common this kind of discrimination was. The case also prompted some legislative attention. A state representative from Phoenix introduced a bill that would require HOA board members in Arizona to complete fair housing training and would create stronger penalties for HOAs that violated disability rights laws. The bill ultimately passed in modified form, and while it was not as strong as the initial version, it was a step in the right direction. A year after I first received that violation notice from Patricia, I was sitting on my back patio on a warm March evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains orange and pink. Apollo was lying at my feet, completely relaxed. My phone buzzed with a text from David checking in to see how I was doing. "Living the dream," I texted back. And I meant it. The HOA had new leadership now. Patricia had eventually resigned from the board entirely after the other board members made it clear she was no longer welcome. The new board president was a retired attorney named Michael Harris, who took fair housing compliance seriously. He had actually reached out to me a few months earlier to ask if I would be willing to review some proposed policy changes from a disability perspective. I had agreed, appreciating the gesture and the genuine desire to do better. I thought about everything I had been through: the harassment, the stress, the health impacts, the legal battle. It had been one of the hardest periods of my life, but I had stood up for my rights and I had won. More importantly, I had hopefully made things easier for the next person with a disability who moved into this neighborhood or any HOA community. Apollo suddenly lifted his head and looked at me intently, his paw coming up to rest on my leg. I recognized the alert immediately and checked my watch just after 7 p.m. I stood up calmly and went inside to get my emergency medication from the kitchen. By the time I took it and settled onto the couch, I could feel the aura starting, that strange sensation that preceded my seizures. But I was safe, I was prepared, and Apollo was right beside me, doing exactly what he had been trained to do. The seizure was mild, thanks to the medication and Apollo's early warning. 15 minutes later I was fine, just tired. I gave Apollo his favorite treats and told him what a good boy he was, and he wagged his tail with pure joy. This was why I had fought so hard. Not for money, not for revenge, but for the right to live safely in my own home with the medical assistance I needed. It was a basic human dignity that everyone deserved, and I was grateful I had been in a position to fight for it. As I sat there that evening with Apollo's head resting on my lap, I felt truly at peace for the first time in over a year. My home was finally the sanctuary it was supposed to be. The neighborhood had become a real community, at least for me and the people I had connected with. And I had learned that standing up for what was right, even when it was hard and scary and exhausting, was always worth it in the end. The next morning, I woke up to an email from a woman in Florida who had read about my case online. She was facing similar discrimination from her HOA over her PTSD service dog and wanted advice on how to proceed. I forwarded her information to David's firm and spent an hour on the phone with her, sharing my experience and encouraging her to fight for her rights. It turned out my case had created a small ripple effect. David told me his firm had received a dozen inquiries from people facing HOA discrimination over service animals in just the past few months. Some of those cases were being resolved quickly once the HOAs received attorney letters, because no one wanted to be the next Desert Vista HOA, sued in federal court and ordered to pay substantial damages. I realized that by standing up for myself, I had inadvertently helped others. That knowledge gave me a sense of purpose and meaning that went beyond my own situation. In late March, the anniversary of when this had all begun, I decided to have a small gathering at my house. I invited Tom and Alina, the young family from across the street, Frank and his wife, and a few other neighbors who had been supportive. David and his wife came too, and we grilled burgers and sat by the pool, enjoying the perfect Arizona spring weather. At one point, Tom raised his beer and proposed a toast. To Derek, for standing up not just for himself but for what was right, and to Apollo, the goodest boy in all of Scottsdale. Everyone laughed and clinked their drinks together, and Apollo's tail thumped against the deck at the sound of his name. As the evening wound down and people started to leave, David pulled me aside. You know, Derek, I have been practicing law for almost 30 years, and I have handled hundreds of cases. But yours is one I am going to remember, not just because we won, but because of how you handled yourself throughout the process. You never got bitter or vengeful. You just wanted justice and to be left alone to live your life. That is rare. I just did what I had to do, I said. That is exactly my point. A lot of people would have given up, moved away, avoided the fight. You did not. You should be proud of that. After everyone left and I cleaned up, I took Apollo for a final walk through the neighborhood. It was late, almost 11, and the streets were quiet. The moon was bright enough that the desert landscape was visible beyond the development, vast and beautiful and timeless. I thought about the federal courthouse, Judge Rivera's stern face as she ruled in my favor, Patricia's pale shock, the endless violation notices, the sleepless nights, the fear that I might lose my home. All of it felt very far away now, like it had happened to a different person in a different life. But it had happened, and it had changed me. I was stronger now, more confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges life threw at me. I knew my rights, and I knew I was willing to fight for them. And I knew that the law, for all its complexity and frustration, was on the side of people like me when we had the courage to use it. Apollo stopped to sniff at something interesting, and I waited patiently while he investigated. A car drove slowly past, and the driver waved. I waved back, not recognizing them but appreciating the friendly gesture. This was my neighborhood now, truly mine in a way it had not been during those dark months of harassment and discrimination. We walked home under the stars, and I felt grateful for everything, for Apollo, for David's skilled representation, for Judge Rivera's moral clarity, for the neighbors who had stood by me, for the laws that protected people like me even when local authorities tried to ignore them. Most of all, I felt grateful for the strength I had found in myself to stand up and fight when it would have been so much easier to give in. Life was good. My health was stable. My home was peaceful. And Apollo was by my side where he belonged, where he had every legal and moral right to be. As I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, Apollo trotting in ahead of me with his tail wagging, I smiled. This was victory, not the settlement check or the judge's order or the HOA's forced apology, but this moment right here. Coming home to a place where I was safe, accepted, and allowed to live with dignity and the medical support I needed. That was all I had ever wanted, and after a year of fighting, I finally had it. The lawsuit was over, the discrimination had ended, and I could move forward with my life. I had won not just a legal case, but something more important, the right to exist peacefully in my own space without having to constantly defend or justify my disability. I gave Apollo his dinner and got ready for bed, feeling more content than I had in months. Tomorrow was Saturday, and I was planning to sleep in, maybe take Apollo to the dog-friendly hiking trail up in the McDowell Mountains, and then spend the afternoon by the pool with a good book. Simple pleasures, the kind everyone deserved. And thanks to the Fair Housing Act, a determined attorney, and my own willingness to fight, I could finally enjoy them without looking over my shoulder or waiting for the next violation notice. As I turned off the lights and climbed into bed with Apollo settling into his spot on the floor beside me, I thought one last time about Patricia and the HOA board, wondering if they had learned anything from this experience. I hoped they had. I hoped no one else would have to go through what I went through. But if they did, at least now there was a precedent, a case they could point to, a reminder that discrimination against people with disabilities was not just wrong but illegal and expensive. Maybe that would make someone think twice before denying the next accommodation request. Maybe that would make another HOA board consult with a fair housing attorney before deciding they knew better than federal law. Maybe something good had come from all of this after all. I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, feeling Apollo's steady breathing nearby, the sound of safety and companionship and everything that made this fight worthwhile. Tomorrow was a new day, and for the first time in a year, I was looking forward to it without any shadow of dread or anxiety. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served, and I was home, truly home, with my loyal companion by my side. That was all the happy ending I needed.